"Thank you for being here," she said with a saccharine smile, her voice dripping with false politeness. Trump nodded slightly, his hands folded in front of him. "My pleasure, Lindsay. Let's see if you can keep up." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, but Moore didn't flinch. She was used to this kind of banter. If anything, she welcomed it. The opening minutes followed a predictable pattern. Politics, policy, the usual back and forth. Moore took shots. Trump swatted them away, effortlessly. The audience was entertained, but they were waiting for something bigger, something personal, and Moore was about to deliver exactly that. She shifted in her chair, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as if preparing to drop a bomb. Then, with a casual air, she leaned in, her eyes gleaming with something just short of malice. And then, she asked the question. For a split second, the room froze. The air felt heavier, as if the temperature had just shifted. The audience, once murmuring and chuckling, fell dead silent. Even the camera operators, trained to remain detached, seemed to hesitate. Lindsay Moore kept her smirk, but something in her posture betrayed her. She had gone too far, and she knew it. The words still hung in the air, bold and shameless. "Have you ever thought about cheating on Melania? Because, let's be honest, she's kind of outdated." It was a low blow, and she had delivered it without flinching. The insult was wrapped in a joke, but there was no mistaking the intent. She wasn't just prodding for a reaction. She was baiting him, daring him to stumble in front of millions of viewers. The audience didn't know whether to gasp or laugh. Some chuckled nervously. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even those who weren't Trump supporters could tell, no, this wasn't just a political jab. It was personal. It was cruel. And for the first time that evening, Trump didn't respond right away. He just stared, not at Moore, not at the audience, but at the desk in front of him, his fingers lightly tapping against the surface. It was subtle, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Lindsay shifted slightly in her chair. She hadn't expected silence. She had expected an outburst, a dismissive wave. But silence? That was something else entirely. Maybe a crude joke in return. But not this. Slowly, Trump lifted his head. His expression was unreadable, a mix of amusement, disbelief, and something sharper. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Let me get this straight," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "You're sitting there, on national television calling my wife, the former First Lady of the United States, outdated?" The word itself lingered, sharp as a blade. Somewhere in the crowd, someone muttered, "Damn." Lindsay gave a half-hearted shrug, clearly trying to maintain her composure. "Oh, come on, Donald," she said, forcing a laugh. "It's just a question. Lighten up." Trump leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "It's not a question, Lindsay. It's an insult." Her smirk wavered. "But let's pretend, for a second, that you actually meant it as a real question." He gestured toward the audience. "Imagine if I flipped it around. Imagine I was sitting here with a married female politician, a Democrat, of course, and I asked her, 'Hey, have you ever thought about cheating on your husband? Because, let's be honest, he's kind of outdated.'" A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded. Others sat up straighter. Trump let the thought hang before continuing. "You'd have CNN running a special about how I'm a misogynist before I even left this building. The headlines would be screaming, and you," he nodded toward her, "you'd be leading the charge." Lindsay opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Trump wasn't done. Lindsay Moore blinked. For the first time in the interview, she looked unsure. The room was no longer hers to control. The audience, which had started the evening leaning in her favor, was shifting, not necessarily toward Trump, but away from her. Trump leaned back in his chair, relaxed, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke again, there was an edge to his voice. let's talk about outdated. The word was hers, but now it belonged to him. He clasped his hands together, his voice steady. Melania Trump speaks 5 languages. She's been a successful businesswoman. She was the First Lady of the United States. And you, a feminist, a champion of so-called women's empowerment, sit here and try to reduce her value to an expiration. Date? Lindsay shifted in her chair, forcing a small smirk. Oh, come on, Donald. It was just a joke. Trump tilted his head. A joke? Well, let me ask you something, Lindsay. Do you have an expiration date? The smirk vanished. The audience made a sound, half gasp, half murmur. Lindsay's fingers twitched slightly against the table. She was calculating, scrambling for a way to spin this back in her favor. Trump didn't wait. You want to talk about outdated, like it's some kind of punchline? Let's be real here. If a conservative man had sat in this chair and called Michelle Obama outdated, you'd be calling for his career, his job, his head on a plate. A flicker of something crossed Lindsay's face. She knew he wasn't wrong, but Trump wasn't finished. You know what's really outdated, Lindsay? He gestured vaguely around the set. This tired, lazy, recycled strategy of trying to humiliate conservative figures by attacking their wives, their families, their marriages. When you can't take me down, you go after the people around me. Lindsay shook her head, laughing lightly. Oh, please, Donald. But Trump cut in, his tone sharper now. Did you ask Joe Biden if he's ever thought about cheating on Jill? No, you didn't. Did you ask Barack Obama if he ever thought about cheating on Michelle? No, you didn't. Because you know it's disgusting. You know it's low. But when it's me, suddenly, it's just a joke. Silence. Even the crew members behind the cameras had stopped moving. Lindsay's jaw was tight. She wasn't used to losing control. But Trump wasn't just on the defense, he was flipping the entire script. He shook his head, exhaling. You know, Lindsay, for years you guys have been screaming about feminism, about women's rights, about respect. And yet, the first chance you get, you sit here and mock a woman, my wife, simply because she's over 50. Another shift in the audience. People were rethinking. Trump let out a chuckle, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was disbelief. So, tell me, Lindsay, when does a woman become outdated in your eyes? What's the cutoff? 45? 50? Should we just start retiring women from relevance once they hit menopause? Lindsay had nothing. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The audience was no longer with her. She had thrown a punch expecting Trump to stumble. Instead, she had given him the moment of the night. But the fallout was just beginning. Lindsay Moore sat up straighter, pushing back against the wave of silence that had settled over the studio. She was scrambling now, trying to regain control, before it slipped entirely out of her hands. A forced laugh. Oh, Donald, you're being dramatic. It was just a little fun. A little? Trump cut in, shaking his head. No. Lindsay, it wasn't, and you know it. Trump's tone was controlled but firm, like a man who had seen this game played 1,000 times before. If it was just a little fun, you wouldn't be squirming in your seat right now. The audience felt the shift. The power in the room had flipped, and everyone knew it. Lindsay tried to push forward, glancing toward the crowd as if looking for support. I think we're getting a little off track here, she said, forcing a light tone. I was just making an observation. Melania is beautiful, of course, but let's be real. Most men in your position tend to, go younger. Trump smirked. And there it is. Lindsay hesitated. There what is? Trump leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk. That little trick you all love to use. You insult someone, you mock them, and when you get called out, you hide behind, I was just making an observation. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of it pressed down on the room. No, Lindsay, you were trying to humiliate my wife. Lindsay opened her mouth, but Trump wasn't finished. And since we're talking about appearances, about outdated people, he gestured toward her. You're what, mid-40s? A sharp inhale. Lindsay's eyes flashed. She forced a smile, but there was nothing natural about it. Why does that matter? Trump shrugged. I'm just making an observation. The audience exploded. Some laughed, some gasped, and others just watched because this wasn't the interview they had expected. Lindsay's face darkened. That's different. Why? Trump's voice was calm, calculated. Because now it's about you? Lindsay stammered. She was losing, and she knew it. Trump pressed on. You want to sit there and talk about outdated women, but the second I turn it around, suddenly it's offensive. Suddenly it's different. You don't like it when the mirror's held up, do you? Lindsay was out of options. She let out a nervous chuckle, waving a dismissive hand. Okay, I get it. Let's move on. Trump leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Yeah, I thought so. And just like that, Lindsay Moore had lost control of the interview. The audience felt it. The crew felt it. And soon, the entire internet would feel it too. It didn't take long. Within minutes of the interview wrapping up, clips of the exchange flooded social media. The moment Lindsay Moore asked her now infamous question, followed by Trump's unflinching takedown, spread like wildfire on X, formerly Twitter. One of the first viral posts summed it up perfectly. Lindsay Moore thought she was about to embarrass Trump. Instead, she got obliterated on live TV. This was brutal. The clip had already amassed over 3 million views within the first hour. Comment sections erupted. Imagine the outrage if someone called Michelle Obama outdated on national TV. Lindsay Moore just played herself. Trump didn't just defend Melania, he exposed the hypocrisy of these so-called feminists. This is why the media is a joke. They preach about women's rights but attack a conservative woman the first chance they get. The divide was instant. Conservatives praised Trump for standing up for his wife and flipping the script on Moore. Liberals scrambled to spin the moment in her favor. On MSNBC, a commentator labeled the exchange an unnecessary outburst and accused Trump of bullying a journalist. But that argument didn't land the way they had hoped. Because people weren't just talking about Trump's response. They were talking about Lindsay's question. Why did she think it was okay to frame Melania that way? Why did she assume women had an expiration date? The backlash against Moore was swift and relentless. By the next morning, headlines dominated the news cycle. Lindsay Moore under fire for disrespectful question about Melania Trump. The Washington Examiner. Did Lindsay Moore cross the line? The Daily Wire. Feminist hypocrisy. Host faces backlash for outdated remark. Fox News sponsors for Moore's show began feeling the heat. Emails poured in, demanding to know if they condoned ageism and double standards. She tried to respond. On Instagram, Moore posted a short, carefully crafted statement. As a journalist, I ask tough questions. That's my job. I regret if my words were misinterpreted, but I stand by my right to challenge public figures. It didn't help, because no one was misinterpreting anything. They had all heard it, clear as day, and the internet wasn't done with her yet. By the next evening, Lindsay Moore's name was everywhere, but not in the way she had hoped. What started as an attempt to humiliate Trump had backfired spectacularly, turning her into the target of a backlash she never saw coming. Media watchdog groups called her out for sexism and hypocrisy. An op-ed in the Wall Street Journal questioned, "Why is a host who claims to champion women tearing one down on live TV?" And the real fallout? It was just beginning. Who had spent years championing women's rights, only to mock a woman based on her age? Even some liberal voices distanced themselves from Moore's remarks. On CNN, Jake Patterson reluctantly admitted, "Look, I'm no fan of Trump, but this question wasn't journalism. It was a cheap shot, and he turned it around on her hard." Meanwhile, conservative news outlets had a field day. On Fox News, a panel dissected the moment frame by frame, calling it one of the most embarrassing cell phones in television history. Behind the scenes, Moore's employers were in full damage, control mode. By the end of the week, a leaked memo revealed that network executives were furious. Publicly, they stood by her. Privately, they knew this was bad. Viewership for her show had plummeted. Advertisers were getting hesitant, and the network wasn't willing to take a hit for her. The following Monday, Lindsay Moore opened her show with an apology, a forced, half-hearted attempt to calm the outrage. In the heat of the moment, I made a remark that was taken the wrong way. It was never my intention to offend or degrade anyone. I deeply respect Melania Trump and regret if my words were misinterpreted. It didn't work. The comments flooded in immediately. Classic non-apology. Taken the wrong way? We all heard you loud and clear. You regret that people noticed your hypocrisy, not what you said. So much for empowering women. By the end of the month, Lindsay Moore was on vacation. Some called it a quiet suspension. Others speculated she was done for good. One thing was certain: she had underestimated Trump. She thought she could land a punch and move on. Instead, she walked into a storm she wasn't prepared for, and the conversation was far from over. Because this wasn't just about Lindsay Moore anymore. This interview had exposed something deeper. In the days that followed, discussions stretched beyond Trump, beyond Melania, beyond even Lindsay. The moment had turned into a debate about media bias double standards, and the way powerful women, especially conservative ones, are treated. Conservative commentators called out the blatant hypocrisy. If this had been a liberal woman, the media would be calling it sexism. But because it's Melania, they laugh. Even some left-leaning voices admitted this was not a good look. The question had been out of line. I don't like Trump, but there was something ugly about using a woman's age as an attack. We don't do that to men. But this conversation wasn't just about Melania Trump anymore. It was about Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Michelle Obama. Women in power who had all at some point been ridiculed. For their looks, for their age, for their husbands. And here's where it got interesting. The same people who had spent years calling out sexism and media bias, suddenly silent when the target was Melania. Trump supporters saw it for what it was. They don't actually care about women. They care about controlling the conversation. And Lindsay Moore, she became the perfect example of what people were tired of. The media's selective outrage. The way some women's dignity was worth defending. But others, fair game. And Trump? He turned the attack into a win. He didn't just defend his wife, he forced the conversation into uncomfortable territory. People had to ask themselves, why was it okay to attack a conservative woman this way? Why do we let some jokes slide, but not others? Why do feminists stay silent when it's a woman they don't like, and whether you agreed with Trump or not? The question stuck. This wasn't just a viral clip. This was a reckoning, and it wasn't going away. The clip didn't just make headlines. It became a turning point. Lindsay Moore's cheap shot at Melania Trump wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It was a mirror held up to the media's hypocrisy. And Trump? He did what few politicians ever managed to do. He didn't get defensive. He didn't lash out. He exposed the double standard, calmly, effectively. And people noticed. For weeks, the internet kept the debate alive. Was this just another example of bias in media? Would a liberal woman have been treated the same way? Why do certain people get protected, while others are fair game? And perhaps the biggest question of all, when did we decide a woman's worth has an expiration date? That last question stuck with people. Because at its core, this wasn't just about Trump. It wasn't just about Melania. It wasn't even about Lindsay Moore. It was about respect. It was about the hypocrisy of the so-called empowerment movement that only protects women they agree with, and for many people watching, it was a wake-up call. Melania Trump was many things: a former model, a businesswoman, a first lady. But she was not outdated, she was not disposable, and no woman should be. The moment Lindsay Moore smirked and thought she had landed her punchline, she had already lost. She exposed herself. And Trump, he didn't just win the argument. He changed the conversation. What do you think? Should more people call out this kind of hypocrisy? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.